Hello, Mr. Boge.
How are you?
This is Munyere. We are with the Msumba here. They just gone to stand up. Somewhere is coming. I leave him here with everything.
I want to confirm.
He actually is in the computer room.
Thank you.
Oh. Oimet, how are you?
Subscribers.
Calvin Koimet, can you hear me?
Yes.
Calvin Koimet,
Guy, missing aviation.
Calvin Koimet.
Yes.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
You are ready, eh?
Yes.
Hey, just for a while, eh? We shall be on. Be prepared. That's one. Then you come now to receive here. You come now. These are the guys who are right now. You're the one here. Yes. This is Mr. Obugi. Cost. And then these are the boys. If you have any question, you only ask. You'll be on. plus a video. It's good for them to see this. Of course, they know your voice. All right, good afternoon. We have our lesson. We agreed that we'll be going back to Theory of Flight 1. You first page on your screen. Let me go back a bit. All right, you can see the first page, Theory of Flight 1. That is where we begin. I believe you have the notes. You've been writing the notes. Those who don't have, I'll organize. But we've been providing these notes on our WhatsApp platform or group. But we'll still see what we can do. There's one guy who asked for the notes. I think I've not made the arrangements, but you'll get the notes. For now, we go straight to our discussion. Theory of Flight 1. Are we communicating? Can you get me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yes.
Teacher, please enlarge the screen.
Pardon?
Okay. Okay. Fine.
All right, in a moment, we are enlarging the screen. Just a moment, we are seeing what we see what we can do. Is that better?
Yes.
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 Thank you, thank you. So let's move on. Let's move on. All right, Theory of Flight 1. We shall go back to Meteorology 1 later on. For now, let us concentrate on Theory of Flight, where I want to believe you have the notes. Now, this is a topic that runs from Form 1 to Form 4. In Form 1, we shall discuss Theory of Flight 1, Form 2, of course, Theory of Flight 2, Theory of Flight 3, Form 3, and then Theory of Flight 4, Form 4. And in Theory of Flight 1, we are concerned with the history of aviation. Then we shall briefly look at classification of aircraft. Then we'll go to parts of an aircraft. Then some bit of basics in science, introduction to science concepts. Then there's a small bit at the tail end which deals with the forces acting on an aircraft. Of course, it's also part of those basics, but it specifically deals with the forces acting on aircraft, basically when it is in flight. So theory of flight 1, and we are looking at the history. That's where we start. I know some people are looking for the subtitle, History of Aviation, but we're just calling it Early Aviation. Now, from your maybe general understanding of aviation, you may have come across many stories about how aviation began. Years, almost 400 years before Christ BC, that's in China. That's where we come across attempts by people to make flying objects. It's actually understood or believed that kites were first made in China those number of years before. Then later on, so we are presenting history of aviation actually in a very summarized form, as you shall see. We cannot exhaust the whole discussion on history. We're just presenting it in a summarized form. That's why you'll see just highlights coming from one period of in history to another, maybe in terms of the centuries and so on. So we're not we're not going down to the details. We're just looking at the general, just an overview of what was happening until where we are today. So I've said early in those days, about 400 or so years before Christ BC, in China, it's documented that we had man-made flying objects. Then later on, in the 3rd century, we see hot air balloons, and later on hydrogen balloons were discovered. Later on in 13th century, only in the 13th century, a gentleman by the name Rogers Bacon, who was an England monk, carried out studies on how air as a fluid could support a craft, just like water with boats. So I want to believe by then boats were already, had already been designed, and someone was trying to find out how water was supporting these vessels floating. And this gentleman, Rogers, carries out some studies in the 13th century on how air could support a craft, just like water with boats. Later on, this gentleman, Leonardo da Vinci, also carried out some studies on how birds could fly. Now, you'll notice, or you'll note that this guy made quite some contribution to the aviation industry. It is still the foundation upon which most aircraft designers are doing their sketches and finally coming up with plans, because he designed the air screw and the parachute. Now the air screw will later on be called the propeller. You must have seen a propeller on an aircraft when you were coming for lessons, or even as you Google, as you look at different types of propeller there. But you may not go that far. We have our small plane here in school, and you must have seen a propeller. There are 2 propellers on each side of the fuselage. All right, we'll talk about that one later on. So more parachutes were developed. Now these 2 developments, in terms of the propeller and the parachute, will later on lead to great achievements in the aviation industry. So this guy, Leonardo, then did some more studies, and he comes up with the discovery of the helicopter, the glider, and the ornithopter. Flap, just like a bird. These are complicated machines even today. If you realize designing a helicopter is not as easy. You may find it easier to design a fixed-wing aircraft than a helicopter. But you can see this is the guy who discovers these things. And most of what is being done on helicopters and even fixed-wing, where we have the propeller, are based on what this gentleman did those many days before. Of course, just like you will discover when you're making something, when you have an idea and you are trying to design maybe a new plane and someone is looking at it, sometimes you tell them this thing will work one day, but they look at you and wonder, are you serious? This is your imagination. I don't think this thing can work. So the same with Leonardo those days. His work somehow looked like it was impractical, but actually it was opening up to greater inventions in the aviation industry. So in 1893, that year is 1893, not 1983. It is in 1893 in France. Now, those who do French, I think you can read that word, those very complicated names. Jean, then we have Francois. These two guys went ahead to fly a hot air balloon invented by the Montgolfier brothers. That was in 1893. So things were happening. Discoveries leading to designs were happening. And those two guys are able to fly a hot air balloon that was made by Montgolfier brothers, which flew for about 8 kilometers. That's quite some substantial distance. Those days, of course, even for now, if you can make something, an aircraft that can fly for 8 kilometers, then that's a great achievement for you. It was powered by wood fire. You may be laughing and wondering, wood fire, but those were the days, and that was the source of power for that hot air balloon. Interestingly, it was also not steerable. You would not control it. So once you are in the air, then you are at the mercy of the wind to take you wherever it wanted to. So figure 1, you are able to see on page 2, you see the hot air balloons. Of course, these are just from the net, just picked and pasted from there. You can see some hot air balloons, some on the extreme left. It's a bit closer, and you can see some two guys there enjoying the ride in the hot air balloon. I was reading the newspaper yesterday, and I realized in the Masai Mara we have a number of balloons, about 8 hot air balloons. And I was interested in the charges for the flight. So the capacity for one hot air balloon is around 16 people. One of the balloons in the Masai Mara. And you may look at it and think it is something cheap. You can see just the basket carrying people there. The huge envelope containing the gas, but you may not believe it. 1 hour flight in a hot air balloon, you leave that place minus 45,000 Kenya shillings. So that tells you it's fairly expensive to fly in a hot air balloon. And there it is. So you are ready to cough some 45K for 1 hour, and you enjoy your flight. They go as far as 8 kilometers high. Then you enjoy the flight over the Mara. Wonderful, spectacular view of the game. All right, the hot air balloons, I've talked about that. In the 19th century, so as I've said, this account that we are giving is actually very summarized, so we are not getting to the details. In the 19th century, British George Cayley came up with a design that combined helicopter and horizontally propelled aircraft. Now that's another complicated design, as you will tell, that making a plane that is able to fly horizontally, yet the same plane can fly as a helicopter vertically, is not an easy one. Those who are keen to see the plane some planes that he came here to Kenya. You realize that was the design. It could land vertically, take off vertically, and then still fly horizontally. So this is what this British Sir George came up with somewhere in the 19th century. He also made the first glider in 1849, the same century, the 19th century. Now you can see a glider there down there in figure 2. Another Briton, Francis, used a wind tunnel. Okay, when we find time, I'll show you a wind tunnel, maybe in an image later on. But is what is used to test small planes, model aircraft are made, and then they are flown inside the wind tunnel. So he made this wind tunnel and was able to predict the possibility of designing an aircraft of one wing above another. Now, that is another design of aircraft that we have today, one wing above another. It's called a biplane, B-I-P-L-A-N-E, biplane, 2 wings, one above another. That was discovered by this gentleman called Francis Herbert Wenham. Then around the same period of time, John Stringfellow designed a steam engine powered aircraft that launched from a wire. Very interesting designs here. Steam powered engine launched from a wire. This design demonstrated lift for Leonardo da Vinci. Some of these designs could not do practical work, but given opportunity later on, you realize people got ideas from what these guys had made and actually made real aircraft that could fly. Lawrence Hargrave, a British-born Australian inventor, made a rigid wing aircraft with flapping blades operated by a compressed air motor. This one was able to fly about 19 meters or 312 feet, the same century. We can move on to the next page, that's page 3. We find another Frenchman there. That is Jean-Marie, whatever. The French, you will call out the other names, you know how to pronounce those names. The Frenchman tested important aspects of flight, such as stability and aerodynamics. Then a great breakthrough came when Samuel Langley created a heavier than air, gasoline-powered engine actually flew. Now, in my discussion with maybe a number of students, I don't know if I had reached this point in our discussion with those who we had discussed with, but this guy, Samuel, somehow history documents that he rushed very fast to do this flight ahead of the Wright brothers. The challenges that the Wright brothers were going through are what made it impossible for them to fly successfully ahead of Samuel Langley. However, there he is. He flies his aircraft, but as you shall see, he crashed with his plane. Luckily, these other guys, the Wright brothers, successfully did theirs, and they flew it, and they made a lot of history. In fact, right now we remember more the Wright brothers than Samuel Langley. Okay, that is history. So he had successfully all right, we are having a challenge there. All right, we are back again. So he had successfully tested it before a full-scale model. He called his aircraft Aerodyne. Of course, as we shall define the term Aerodyne, Aerodyne refers to a heavier than air aircraft, heavier than air aircraft. It was powered by 53 horsepower. Remember, the engine power is measured in terms of horsepower. 53 horsepower, 5-cylinder radial engine. Okay, that name is long and you may not understand it, but I've said the engine power, the aircraft engine power is measured in terms of horsepower. And then the cylinder, 5-cylinder radial engine. We have different designs of engine. The cylinders are arranged either radially, in other words, around the central portion, where we have the crankshaft. So the crankshaft is in the middle. Then the cylinders are disposed of around the crankshaft. That's the radial engine. Then we have another engine. I'm just giving you some of the examples of these engine designs. We have another type of engine design called horizontally opposed. Now, granted, when you come back after all this long break, when you look at our aircraft, you realize it is a horizontally opposed engine. The cylinders are in opposite directions. No, they are mounted opposite each other. The crankshaft in the middle. That is a horizontally opposed engine. So I've just given you some designs of engine cylinder arrangements. One of them is radial, another one is like the V, and then the inline. So we have different types. So whatever this guy designed was a 5-cylinder radial engine. Unfortunately, in 1903, December, this guy crashed with his aircraft in Potomac River. Unfortunate. But now you can see it was just days before. So the Wright brothers were down to business and working very hard. They wanted to fly their plane. But this guy, let me just give you something brief background. That Samuel Langley, he was actually, I think, working installation. So he was enjoying the, and that's why he was able to rush very fast and do his design and flight. These other guys, who were the Wright brothers, were on their own. So they were working very hard, despite so many challenges they were going through. That's why later on you will see they go to France. When you look at figure 3 down there, they go to France, and that's where they now are able to do their aircraft and complete it properly. Then they now come back and flight. So Samuel rushed his program. He managed, of course, but unfortunately later on it crashes in this river, the Potomac River. All right, that is history, as I've said. So all these attempts and discoveries were made, but the challenge was control and stability for sustained flights. Remember, even as we are talking, as we are discussing, these two are still the greatest challenges for aircraft designers. If you try to make your small aircraft, and model aircraft, of course, you realize your one major challenge will be control. It can take off, but then controlling it when it is airborne is not always very easy. It can take off at the time you have decided it will take off, scheduled time, but sustaining this aircraft in the air until the time you want it to land is always the challenge. And then number 2, stability. So these are two things that aircraft designers are sleeping late or having sleepless nights trying to manage control and stability. Even some of these planes, if you read the history of some of the air crashes that we've been having, you will see something on control and stability. That this plane was designed but had problems, some problems with control and stability at certain phases, during certain phases of flight. Maybe during takeoff, it will behave like this, or during landing, it will behave like that. So these are two things that most designers, even as we are talking, are grappling with. All right. Then we come towards the end of this history, Kitty Hawk, and later, when you talk about Kitty Hawk, we are actually referring to these two gentlemen, the Wright brothers. They're the ones who now step onto the scene and they make history. The famous Wright brothers were on their way to make their first historical flight aboard their plane called the Flyer. This occurred in 1903, December 17th at 10:35 a.m. You can see it's very precise. Now, if you look at the previous paragraph, we're talking about Samuel Langley, who in the same year, same month, crashes with this plane in Potomac River. Then these guys come in, the same year, same month, 17th. So maybe Samuel may have crashed early in the month. And it's design, but I think he may have not considered a few things. These guys took their time. They did and fixed every part of their design to ensure it works properly. And there they make their successful flight in December 1903, December 17th at 10:35 a.m. Ovil at the controls, they made their first heavier than air machine-powered flight that lasted 12 seconds. 12 seconds and spanned 40 meters. Now, those days, that was a great achievement, great achievement. And there you can see these guys aboard one of their planes. Now, we've talked about the biplane, which someone designed. And here it is. This is a biplane, two wings, one above another. And in between the wings, you can see these guys doing their flight, right? In August 1903, Wilbur, that's Ovid's brother, went to France. In December 1908, he completed a 2-hour, 20-minute flight, which saw him have full control over his flight. And I always take time to look at these two. In 1903, just before 1908, of course, 5 years earlier, in 1903, we see these two guys flying their Flyer, their aircraft, and it takes how long? 12 seconds. 5 years later, they make another plane. They study the mistakes. They look at the mistakes. They discover this is where we went wrong. And you can't believe, from 12 seconds to 2 hours, 20 minutes. Now, that is a great leap. It's a great improvement. So if you're having challenges, you can be sure you can still do much better because you learn from your mistakes. 12 seconds, you come to 2 hours, 20 minutes. You have made a great improvement. So don't give up. There's still hope for you. Work harder. Just look at where you're going wrong. Make it, correct it, and your plane will fly much, much longer. This aircraft was later bought by the military. Now, don't you think that's great? You have struggled. The person who was competing you had the support of the government. Unfortunately, he has crashed with his plane. Now, you went the hard way, or you chose the difficult path. These guys are on their own. That's why they go to France, because they're not getting the support they need. So they move away. Remember, you're talking about Kitty Hawk in the US. They go to France. That's where they are able to now do all this stuff. And when they come back, the military, now the government comes to buy their plane. The government that had not given them the support is now the one giving them the support. It buys their aircraft. So it tells you sometimes going the difficult way comes with very good things. You learn a lot. You become much more experienced than if you just decide to go the easy path. All right, so there you have these two guys, and they have made their plane. The military buys the plane, used for 2 years. 2 years is quite a long time in an aircraft. Because I've talked about a hot air balloon. For 1 hour, they're charging 45,000 shillings. Now, this is 2 years of use of this military plane, after which it was retired to the Smithsonian Institution, where it is to date. There were more developments in aircraft design before the World War I. This saw the pusher aircraft being succeeded by tractor aircraft. We'll talk about the pusher and the tractor later on. The first transcontinental flight occurred in the US by this guy called P. Rogers in 1911. So we are now in the 20th century. We've moved all the way from 400 BC. We are now in the 20th century. And this guy, an American, Rogers, another Rogers again, in 1911, conducts a transcontinental flight. Of course, that's across the continent. And this flight takes 3 days, 10 hours, and 14 minutes. And again, by the aircraft made by these two gentlemen, the Wright brothers. So you can see they're able to do something very great, the Wright brothers. And there they are. Their planes are being purchased. They're being bought by guys, military. P. Rogers is also using the plane. So a great achievement by the Wright brothers. During the World War II, down there, the aircraft was extensively used in warfare. Remember, we're now talking about the World War, and the planes that are made by these two gentlemen were being extensively used. Initially, of course, we had a lot of marine. Now we are in the air. Of course, we on the land. Then we have the waters. We have the ships. Now they're in the air. And I was reading something yesterday. I always encourage you to read the newspapers. I was reading something yesterday in the papers, and there's a senior security officer in the US who says even the space is now being used as another domain for warfare. So apart from land, water, and air, people are now considering the space to take the war to the space. Now, in the World War II, we see the planes are being used, of course, for, I don't know if those days, I don't think much of surveillance was being done using the planes, but flying and bombing, releasing the bombs from the air to hit and destroy targets. That's World War II. At this time, the Pan American Airlines was the largest in the world. Pan Am, if you've heard of Pan Am, there it is, Pan American Airlines. Okay, by then, I don't think you were born. That was around 1986, when a Pan American Airlines plane was shot down. It was flying over Scotland. And it brought a lot of problems with Libya. All right, so it served 46 countries. Aviation started creating jobs. By this time, 193,000 people had benefited from this. The number grew to 450,000 by 1941. On page 4, we see after World War II. By this time, people having discovered the plane can now be used extensively. You can see Boeing steps onto the scene. They're the ones to start making some of the largest ahead age. We've seen quite a number of very good designs, including the Boeing 747, now the Dreamliner 787. So it had stepped out to the scene and it was making some large aircraft. Larger designs were also being made in terms, and of course, the larger the aircraft, the more complicated in terms of speed, size, and altitude of operation. I remember we're talking about right now planes flying to as high as 50,000 feet above sea level, very high. Supersonic planes were also being developed around this period. Such aircraft as the Voyager was one of the developments at post-World War II. So all these have been developments. To the present now, 2001 to the present, we see more sophisticated planes being designed. Among them, the UAVs, that's the unmanned aerial vehicles. Of course, they're being flown remotely. You don't find a pilot there. It has gone to as far as the drones, also being part of these unmanned aerial vehicles. And the sophistication continues. You can see in that paragraph, just before the drone in figure 4, we see the first plane to land unmanned, the longest time ever. Of course, by this time that we were writing this account, 23 hours, 23 minutes, longest point-to-point flight ever undertaken, non-stop and unrefueled. So these are developments that have been taking place in the aviation industry. Later on in 2003, the first totally autonomous flight across Atlantic by computer-controlled model aircraft occurred. Now, as you're talking about this, remember there are more designs coming up. There are more developments coming up. And you should be part of that history so that you also design your own plane and you can be in 020. There is a student at Mangu High School who designed a plane. So don't be left behind. You can use the knowledge you're learning, put it together, do something. All right. Maybe I can get a question before we go to aircraft classification. Can we get 1 or 2 questions? Question? All right, that is Hamza.
Excuse me, teacher. I wanted to ask: will we be asked a question about all those inventors and people included in aviation industry?
Yeah, we sometimes, I've not seen it much in the KCSE, but you see we have guys who are outstanding in these contributions, like the Wright Brothers, like Leonardo da Vinci. These are guys that are known all over the place. You never know, someone can ask you about their contribution. If we are to test at our level here in school, then maybe out of what we've just discussed, that is where we limit ourselves. Correct?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome. All right, we have, is that Manuel? Apollo.
Yes,
Apollo,
yes.
go ahead.
Excuse me, Chair. I was asking
Yes.
about the Wright brothers.
Mm.
You were there where you were saying that Wilbur is the one who went to France. That aircraft that flew for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Did both of them create it, or was it only Wilbur?
Yeah, actually, they were working together. These guys are working together. If you read the history, they both went to France and they were working together. They were working very closely together.
Okay.
I also encourage you, brothers and sisters, to have that unity and cooperation.
Yes.
You cannot do much. All right, that's our Paula.
Yes.
Okay, there was another hand. I don't know. I saw another hand. All right, I think we can move on. Okay, let's move. Okay, why nine? Brevi.
Yes.
Yes, Brevi.
I have read somewhere there that there was a plane and it flew for a few days.
Pardon?
I'm saying,
Yes.
I've seen somewhere that it says that there was a plane that actually flew for a few days.
It flew for?
I'm not so sure about the days, but it was a few days I saw there.
All right. Yes, it was a transatlantic flight that was used by Wright. He was flying in a plane made by the Wright Brothers.
Okay, so my question is, did they have break? I have two questions actually. Were they landing at specific points and then they continued, or was it a non-stop?
Yes, he was. No, it was not a non-stop.
And those planes, were they using only the wind, only the turbines, or only the propellers, or do they also use some kind of fuel to power their engines or something?
Maybe I can clarify something there.
Yes.
Fuel a must. Remember, we talked about gasoline powered at some point.
Yes.
Now, these were, of course, piston engines. We have two classifications of engines. We have piston engines and gas turbine engines. So initially at this stage, it is piston engines. All right?
Yes.
So the piston engine will always use a propeller. So these planes were basically powered by primarily gasoline fuel, and then using piston engines having propellers. Later on, then you will now see the gas turbine engines, gas turbine engines also coming into operation. Designs of gas turbine engines will come later on, but here, initially, it is mostly piston engines with propellers.
Okay.
I hope I've answered your question.
Yes.
Are we okay?
Yes.
All right. There, I don't see any other question. Is that Henry?
Yes.
Momo. Momo, go ahead. Momo, go ahead. Henry.
When we are talking
All right, there
about
you
this, when you're talking about the supersonic planes, at which speed do we start ranking them?
Momo, you've gone out of our discussion. You've gone outside our discussion. Nevertheless, I'll answer your question, but let's stick to our discussion. You're asking the range of speed of supersonic flights?
Yes.
Okay. That supersonic, if you look at the word supersonic, it has two words, super and sonic. Sonic has to do with the speed of sound. Then super is always beyond or above. You can see superior and so on. So we are saying beyond the speed of sound. So supersonic, we are talking about anything beyond the speed of sound in the range of Now we always talk about this, when you talk about aircraft and in terms of the speed of sound, we use the designation Mach number. Mach of MACH. So if it is Mach 1, then the plane is flying at the speed of sound, Mach 1. That means equivalent to the speed of sound, which is around 340 meters per second. So as we go to the super, then we are talking about 1.2, 1.8. We're going all the way to almost 2. But remember, we also have the hypersonic. So it's about the speed of sound in terms of the super. Remember, we have the subsonic, which is below the speed of sound, subsonic. Then we have transsonic. We are now crossing the range of the speed of sound, transsonic. Then we have supersonic, and we have hypersonic. So hyper is the extreme, very, very high speeds. The spacecraft and so on, very high speeds. Nevertheless, 1.2, 1.5, 1.8, we are fairly in the supersonic speed. I don't know if I've answered your question. Have I answered your question? Okay, let's move on. Yes? Is that Manuel?
Oh, you said yes.
Is that Manuel?
Yes.
Yes, Manuel. Go ahead, go ahead.
You said supersonic planes are planes that travel faster than the speed of sound.
Correct.
Did those planes have pilots in them?
Do they?
And we were taught that when it gets to a certain speed.
Pardon, do they?
Oh, you've told us.
Let me interrupt you. Manuel, who is that?
Yes.
Is that Manuel? Manuel.
Yes.
Start afresh your question.
Oh, you have told us that supersonic planes are those planes that travel at a speed above the speed of sound. And our aviation teacher told us that there is a certain speed that it gets to where there is no way pilots can fly well in that plane. Now, did the supersonic planes have pilots in them?
They do. You can imagine the spacecraft that are flying at sometimes 11 kilometers per second. And you see some of these spacecraft have people in them, have astronauts in them. So supersonic is not a speed that is too high to have a pilot on board.
Okay.
So they have pilots. Welcome. All right, let's. I think we can move on to the classification of aircraft. I'll try to generally classify this very fast. Now we classify planes just for the sake of understanding. For the sake of understanding that this plane falls in this category, that plane falls in the other category. So that when you see a plane, probably you are explaining to someone about that particular plane, then all right, we're having a bit of a problem with the network, but let me just continue. I was saying, for the sake of understanding aircraft, it's good that we have a bit of knowledge on how to classify them. So ikiwa imehang all right, I hope you can get me again. We were just beginning aircraft classification. And I was saying it's important for one to understand how to classify aircraft. So that this is just for knowledge purposes. I was also saying you can share that information or knowledge with any other person concerning your good knowledge on how to classify planes. Now we have a number of ways of classifying aircraft. One of them is based on whether the aircraft is lighter than air or heavier than air. For the lighter than air aircraft, talk about them generally, the classifications. They use gas. This gas, as you shall see in chemistry, is a gas that is lighter than air. We have gases that are lighter than air, we have gases that are heavier than air. So for the lighter than air aircraft, also called aerostats, they use a gas that is lighter than air. This includes the hydrogen, helium, and hot air. All these are gases. So when these gases are filled in an envelope, or a gas bag, or a balloon, and released, you realize they soar into the atmosphere, they move upwards into the atmosphere, and they float just like ship on water. Now they do this by displacing the surrounding air, and the air that is being surrounded has this weight equal to the weight of the gas bag or this balloon plus the contents of the balloon. That is the principle that you need to understand. The principle of buoyancy. That a lighter than air aircraft uses a gas that is lighter than air. If someone asks you to name two gases that are lighter than air, then you will have hydrogen and helium. You can put there the hot air, but of course if it's a gas in any other circumstances out there, then we are talking about general hydrogen and helium being two gases lighter than air. But for the purposes of our discussion, then hot air also comes in, because that's now heated air, lighter than air also. As we're saying, for it to get lift or gain lift, these aerostats will be filled with this lighter than air gas and released. When it is released, it starts soaring or going high into the atmosphere, and that's lift. It gains its lift that way. In the process, the principle behind it is called buoyancy, the principle that explains how this aircraft will be moving up in the atmosphere, this aerostat. And we are saying the explanation is that it displaces the surrounding air. And the weight of this air being displaced is equal to the weight of this balloon plus the contents inside the balloon. Remember, if it's a hot air balloon, we have some other equipment attached to the balloon, which are the baskets that we saw in the hot air balloon in our, when we were starting our discussion. There's a basket that is carrying people. So the weight of the balloon and the basket and the people and the ropes, everything is then equal to the air that is being displaced by this balloon as it is soaring higher and higher into the atmosphere. Remember, atmosphere is full of air. There's no vacuum in the atmosphere. And as someone will say, nature hates a vacuum. So anywhere there's a vacuum, you realize atmosphere, which is air, would like to move in and occupy that vacuum. And so as this aerostat, the lighter than air aircraft, is moving up into the atmosphere, it is actually displacing the air. And this air that is being displaced is equal to the weight of the balloon plus the contents of this balloon. That principle is called buoyancy. So buoyancy, if you are to define buoyancy, is the upward force caused by fluid pressure that keeps things afloat. And of course, as this air is being displaced, it moves, of course, it gives way, but then as it is displaced, it is the one that's now giving this upward force to the balloon to keep it afloat, to keep it in the atmosphere, floating in the atmosphere. The net upward force of buoyancy is equal to the magnitude of the weight of the fluid displaced by the body. Aircraft gains lift by displacing air of equal weight to the body of the balloon and the contents of the balloon. That is an aerostat. Now, examples of these are the airship. We can see the airship, and it has been given the name the Zeppelin. Of course, that is now the name of the designers of this airship. An airship is actually a lighter than air aircraft. Now, I've said we have a number of ways of classifying aircraft. One of them is whether the aircraft is lighter than air or heavier than air. An example of a lighter than air aircraft, which is called an aerostat, is the airship. And the designers of this, or the makers of this aircraft, have called it Zeppelin. So don't give Zeppelin as an example of a lighter than air aircraft. The name is actually airship. All right. And then we have another classification. Now we shall come back to the airship later on to see how to classify it again, because I've said we have a number of ways of classifying. Then another way of classifying airplanes or aircraft, apart from lighter than air aircraft, we also have the heavier than air aircraft. Now for the heavier than air aircraft, let me see if I can quickly get there. There we are. For the heavier than air aircraft, they're also called aerodynes. Then they gain their lift in a different way. Or aerodynes, then their lift, because we're talking about lift, they gain their lift based on the principle of Sir Isaac Newton, or the third law of Sir Isaac Newton. That's number one. Number two, it's also based on another principle called Bernoulli's principle. Now, these two will be discussed a bit in detail later on. But for now, we can mention that one of the explanations behind lift creation on a heavier than air aircraft is based on the third law of Sir Isaac Newton, which states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And so as the air, because these are now aircraft that mostly have wings to fly. So these wings, as they are flying through the air, they deflect the air downwards. Mark that as the wing is flying through the air that is flowing over the wing is deflected downwards. This downward deflection of air is the one that gives a reactionary force in the opposite direction to push the wing upwards. So the air is moving downwards, but it is producing a reaction which pushes the wing upwards. That's the first explanation of how heavier than air aircraft gains lift. That as it's flying through the air that is flowing over and below the wing is finally being deflected downwards. And based on Newton's third law of motion, that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, then the action is the downward deflection of air. the reaction is the force upwards, which pushes the wing up to create lift. The second explanation is based on Bernoulli's principle, which we may not break down right now very well, but I'll try to explain. For Bernoulli's principle, it states that when air velocity increases, and when air velocity decreases, pressure increases. So they move in opposite directions, velocity and pressure. I'll state it again, Bernoulli's principle. Bernoulli is a Swiss scientist, or was a Swiss scientist, Daniel Bernoulli. And he discovered this principle that says, or states, when air velocity increases, its pressure decreases. And when air velocity decreases, its pressure increases. So when air is rushing over the wing of the aircraft, that high velocity of air rushing on top of the wing, remember the wing is designed in such a manner that the air flowing over the wing moves faster than the air moving below. Mark that statement. When it's flying through air, the airflow over the wing is moving faster than the airflow under the wing. Now we have said the higher the velocity of the airflow, the lower the pressure. So the air on top is moving very fast. That means pressure is dropping. But the air below is moving slower. That means the pressure is high. The wing, under the wing, and that can tell you that you are likely to have an upward force because there is a low pressure over the wing. So there is a kind of a partial vacuum over the wing because of the very high velocity of air, low pressure. Under the wing, low velocity, high pressure. So the high pressure tends to force its way through the wing to occupy the low pressure on top of the wing. And in the process, we get an upward force called the lift, or lift. So those are two arguments or explanations of lift when it comes to heavier than air aircraft gaining lift. One, Newton's third law of motion. We have said for this one, which states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The downward deflection of air as it passes over the wing creates an upward reaction. That's lift. The second explanation, we have said, is based on Bernoulli's principle, which says as the air velocity increases, the pressure decreases. As air velocity decreases, the pressure increases. We have said, as the air is flowing over the wing, the design is that the air flowing over is moving faster, it's accelerated. So there's low pressure on top of the wing. The air moving below the wing moves slower. That's the design of the wing, of course. You may be wondering why. That's the design of the wing. So it's moving slower. So there's high pressure under the wing. There is low pressure over the wing. This differential, the difference in pressure over the wing and under the wing, makes the pressure below, which is very high, to push the wing upwards as if to occupy the low pressure zone over the wing. And we get lift that way. So two explanations based on Newton's third law of motion and also based on Bernoulli's principle. Now with sketches that should be able to explain much more. All right, That is one way of classifying aircraft, based on whether it is lighter than air aircraft or heavier than air aircraft. And I've said for the lighter than air aircraft, they gain their lift because they use a gas that is lighter than air. For heavier than air aircraft, they have wings, and these wings produce lift based on two scientific principles. Newton's third law of motion that states for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, and Bernoulli's principle, which states that when air velocity increases, pressure decreases. When air velocity decreases, pressure increases. That is one way of classifying aircraft. Number two is based on whether the aircraft is powered or mechanically powered or non-mechanically powered. That's another way of classifying aircraft. Is the aircraft mechanically powered or non-mechanically powered? If it is mechanically powered, then it has an engine. Mechanically powered. If it is non-mechanically powered, then it does not have an engine. Remember I said we'll go back to the airship. Now, an airship is a lighter than air aircraft, that's an aerostat, but it is a mechanically powered aircraft because an airship has an engine. So you can see, much as a hot air balloon and an airship are in the same category as lighter than air, they get separated when it comes to whether they are mechanically powered or non-mechanically powered. So one of them is mechanically powered. A bit of a challenge there. We are back again. So I was saying that having talked about classification based on whether the aircraft is lighter than air, heavier than air, we can now again go to another form of classification, which is based on whether or non-powered. Sometimes you'll find the word powered or non-mechanically powered. For the powered, they have the engines, which make them move. For the non-mechanically powered, they do not have engines. And I say we'll go back to the airship. Now, for the airship, you realize it is in the same category as the hot air balloon. They're in the same category if we talk about lighter than air aircraft. But when you talk about mechanically powered or non-mechanically powered, they're not in the same category. Because a hot air balloon is non-mechanically powered. An airship is mechanically powered. It has an engine. So if we talk about the mechanically powered, then you'll find lighter than air aircraft, again, are found in the same category as heavier than air aircraft. Because an airship is lighter than air, but it has an engine, just like a jet aircraft, which also has an engine. So they fall in the same category if we are to classify based on whether they are mechanically powered or not. The balloon will now fall in the same category as a kite, because a kite is a heavier than air aircraft, but you can see the two could have fallen in different categories if we were to talk about heavier than air and lighter than air. But because we're now talking about whether they are powered or not, then they fall in the same category because the hot air balloon and the kite are not mechanically powered. So they're in the same category, much as one is heavier than air, the other one is lighter than air. So that is another way of classifying aircraft. Is it mechanically powered? Powered. Then lastly, we can classify an aircraft based on the use. Based on the use. So we have the commercial aircraft and we have the military aircraft. Yeah. So that you can now talk about probably the civil aircraft and military aircraft. So are they used by civilians, the common people? Anything that is not military is civilian. So is this plane civilian or civil or military? If it is being used by the military, that's actually military. The fighter jets and so on. So you can also classify aircraft based on its use. What is it used for? Military purposes or civilian purposes? So the others are, whatever you see in the notes, some additions to the lighter than air, then we have plus lift. Yeah, so can it generate lift? A balloon and an airship, yes, they are lighter than air. They're also able to gain lifts. They're able to generate lift on their own. Then we have the hybrids. Hybrid is usually an entity or an element that borrows its characteristics from two different sources. That's a hybrid. So it is not pure. If it is a hybrid airship, it's not a pure airship. If it's a moored balloon, now moored means it is tethered. Tethered means it uses ropes. It is fastened. So it's a balloon. It can fly in the atmosphere. It can soar into the atmosphere, but it is secured using ropes to the ground. So it is limited in terms of its flight. It can only operate to as high as the length of the ropes securing it to the ground. That is a moored or tethered balloon. It's also called captive balloon. Captive, tethered, or moored balloon. And I think the last 5 minutes, we can wind up with a few questions on classification. I think this is an area that I cannot rush through. Let me see if there are questions as we wind up in the next 5 minutes. Any question on classification or the first section of history? We can still answer some questions. All right? Let's get the first one. We seem not to have. All right, there you are, Manuel.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
You said that lift is one of the 4 forces that act on an aircraft in flight. Which are the other 3 forces?
All right, we'll come to that, Manuel, but I can still tell you some of the other 3 forces. We have talked about lifts, right? Right, then we also have weight. Weight is just a natural force. Anything, I think anything, has weight. Then we have thrust, which makes the plane to move forward, thrust. And finally, we have drag. Drag opposes thrust, acts in the opposite direction to thrust. It resists the forward movement. So thrust, forward, drag, opposes that, so rearwards. Then we have lift, upwards, and weight, downwards. Correct?
Yes. Is weight caused by gravity?
Yes, that's the gravity. The force of gravity.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's get welcome. Adrian, go ahead. We've had a challenge there. Go ahead.
Today I wanted to answer his question, but you have already said the 4 types of forces that act on an aircraft.
Ah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. All right, as we wind up, the last question, spare the question for next time. The last question, let's see. Last question. All right, we don't have any question. So thank you, God bless you. Let's hope to meet next week. Take care. So that you stay well and safe. Thank you, God bless you.
God bless you.
God bless you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
God bless you.
Bless you.
Same to you.
Have
Bye.
a good rest of the week.
God bless
You have a wonderful week.
Good night.
you. Bye.
Yeah.